Hello, my name is Maxim Yakovlev. I am director of the School for Policy Analysis at the National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy in Kyiv, Ukraine, and I'm proud and happy to host here and moderate a discussion between two great minds and thinkers of our time, Johnstone Family Professor in Psychology at the Harvard University, Steven Pinker, and a historian, professor in the Department of History at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Yuval Noah Harari. So my first question, just to kick off our discussion with a more provocative note, is about an optimistic and a pessimistic perspective of our future. So if I be very rude and place you both into two different camps, like an optimist and a pessimist regarding the future, I would like to hear your opinion if you could really think of yourself as an optimist or pessimist about the future, and generally speaking, how do you perceive our future, the future of humankind? Is it really an optimistic one or a pessimistic one?
I'm often pigeonholed as an optimist, although I have a paper trail of having a rather dark view of human nature in my book, The Blank Slate. I argue that there is such a thing as human nature and that it has some rather dark motives. But on the other hand, to counteract the accusation that I faced when writing The Blank Slate, that a belief in human nature leads to a fatalistic or dark view of the human condition, that there's no point in trying to reduce war and violence because it's in our genes, it's our evolutionary legacy. I pointed out that that human nature has many parts, that we do have some ugly motives like revenge and dominance and sadism, but we also have sympathy, we also have we're a cognitive creature. We have the ability to think up solutions to problems, to share them via language. And so what actually happens in human society depends on the balance between the better angels of our nature, as Abraham Lincoln called them, and our dark side. And that, as a matter of fact, there can't be a debate as to whether human nature condemns us to constant violence and war and prejudice, because the history tells us that there has been human improvement. And that led me to try to unearth data on human progress, the fact that our lifespans have more than doubled, that rates of death in war have come down, rates of death in homicide, violence against women, disease. Pointing out that we have made progress in the past, I don't really consider optimism. I just consider attention to data, to facts that many people are just unaware of. Many people are shocked to hear that rates of death in war have gone down over the last 75 years, or that lifespans have doubled, that famine is reduced, illiteracy is down. Now, whether that's cause for optimism in the future is impossible to say. No one is a prophet. That we're doomed, we're condemned, can be rejected, because we at least know that improvement is possible because it's taken place. Whether it will continue is a different question. Maybe things will get worse, but they won't necessarily get worse given that we know that we've solved problems in the past.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would largely agree that I think I can summarize the current human condition like in 3 brief sentences. That things for humans are better than ever, things are still quite bad, and things can get much, much worse. Now, whether that makes me an optimist or a pessimist, it's, I don't know, it's a mute question. I think we need to be realists. And what we can certainly agree about is that history is not deterministic, that there is no deterministic force which mandates that the future will be better or that it will be worse. It depends on the decisions and actions that we take in the coming years, in the coming decades. If we had this interview, this talk, I think 5 years ago, both of us, I guess, would be far more optimistic. Given the events of the last 3-4 years, we are a bit more pessimistic.
Or a bit more realistic.
Or a bit more realistic, yeah.
Speaking about an optimistic and a pessimistic perspective of our future, maybe you could elaborate more on the risks and threats that, in your view, are the most important now and the most challenging to humanity.
Of the current threats, I would identify climate change as the most obvious. We're not on track to solving it. And there's every reason to believe that the consequences could be terrible. and the threat of nuclear war, not because I think it's particularly likely. I don't think it's likely, but on the other hand, it's not negligibly unlikely. It's a high enough probability that we should worry about it. As with climate change, the direction that we've moved in the last 5 years has not been positive. There's the scrapping of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Force Treaty. There's the threat of a new nuclear arms race. Whereas before that, there was progress. There's an 85% reduction in the size of the nuclear arsenal since the height of the Cold War. But there are reasons to be concerned now, and possible brinkmanship with North Korea, with Russia. So it's something to worry about.
The nuclear war and climate change, the risk of disruptive technologies, especially artificial intelligence and biotechnology, which of course hold also enormous promises to humankind, but also some very serious threats, whether it's a complete social upheaval as a result of changing the job market very, very quickly, whether it's the rise of new digital dictatorships and totalitarian regimes worse than anything we've seen before in history. And maybe the biggest problem with all that is that for all three threats, whether we talk about nuclear war or climate change or the rise of disruptive technologies, to do something effective against the threat, you need global cooperation. I think it's very obvious that you can't solve climate change just on the level of one country. Similarly, you can't regulate artificial intelligence just on the level of one country, because nobody would like to stay behind. If you think about, I don't know, conducting genetic engineering experiments on humans, even if 90% of countries decide not to do it, if you have just one country that does it, the advantages could be so big that everybody will soon copy it, because nobody would like to stay behind. So you need global cooperation. And in the last 3 or 4 years, the world is running in the opposite direction of more and more tensions, and really the threat of the complete breakdown of the global system, and with nothing to replace it. I mean, there is a lot of criticism in recent years of the old system, and it certainly has its problems. But what really concerns me is that when I listen to the critics, I don't hear any alternative. So you have a lot of populist and nationalist leaders and movements criticizing the current global order. And they have a lot of sometimes good ideas about what to do in their own country, but they don't have any plans for how to manage, how to run the world as a whole. They seem to have a vision of the world as a kind of network of fortresses, and they hope that it will be a network of friendly fortresses, but fortresses are seldom friendly. If you don't have a real global system, there is no way to resolve disputes, whether in trade or whether territorial between countries, and there is certainly no way to confront issues like climate change and like disruptive technology. So this is why I'm now less optimistic than I was, say, 4 or 5 years ago.
Let us now change the topic a bit and talk about the intellectual climate of the Western world generally, because the topics we discussed, they are related to this phenomenon of this free thought and how we talk about things in the Western world. Maybe you could elaborate on your perception of what are the challenges to the intellectual Western world now, and maybe your suggestions on how to improve it.
Continue with your question. What really fascinates me about your work and your position right now, that my feeling is that the world is running mainly on philosophical ideals from the 17th and 18th century, which were built on a completely different understanding of human nature. And so far, all the amazing advance, all the amazing progress in understanding better human nature and the brain and genetics and so forth has led to almost no change in our ethical and philosophical views. And I sometimes have a suspicion that we are like running on the last gas in the gas tank, in our philosophical gas, that we are facing philosophical bankruptcy, because the new challenges, especially from the new technologies, climate change and nuclear war, in a way, are kind of easy problems, because we don't know what to do about it. We need to prevent them. That's very easy. Maybe not everybody agrees that it's a real threat. Maybe not everybody agrees how to stop it. But in principle, nobody says, hey, climate change, that's great. Let's have more of that. Nuclear war, yes, I'm in favor. Nobody says that. But with technological disruption, what to do with AI and bioengineering, there is absolutely no agreed goal. I mean, the dreams of some people are the nightmares of other people. And when you think about issues like free will, like the changing human nature itself, I suspect that we just don't have the philosophical basis to discuss it, or certainly to understand where we are heading. And I would be very, very interested to hear your views on it, whether we need a complete new philosophical revolution, given what we now know about human nature.
Yeah. So I wrote a book with enlightenment in the title, and some people have misinterpreted it as a call to go back to the wisdom of the Enlightenment philosophe and use that as the basis of a kind of secular religion. And that could not be farther from the argument. And in fact, the Enlightenment philosophers themselves would be the first to reject that, because the emphasis, or at least the ideals of the Enlightenment that I think are worth preserving, are almost by definition eternal, like reason. We can't really debate whether or not we should use reason, because if we're having that debate, we're using reason. That's a game that you just can't get out of, because if you talk about getting out of it, you're using reason. Likewise, the other core idea of the Enlightenment, which I think is really not negotiable, is sympathy, or maybe objectivity would be a better way to talk about it. The fact that I can't privilege my interests over yours just because I'm me and you're not, and hope to continue the conversation. There's just an inherent symmetry of interests in the very act of being involved in discourse and in being a social creature.
If you're involved in discourse, yes.
Yes.
If you're involved in other kinds of human actions, then not necessarily.
No, that is true. So if you are just in a war of all against all, and you don't need to recruit allies, you don't need to persuade anyone of anything, then you can be a complete psychopath. The problem is that everyone else will simply treat you like an animal or like a fire to be put out, and you can't hope to persuade them to show mercy on you. As soon as you begin the conversation, you're committed to reason, you're committed to symmetry, which means some degree of sympathy. Those are ideas that can't go away. That's what we have to use as a basis for building a coherent moral and political philosophy. And indeed, it will have to go beyond what they thought up in the 18th century, because they didn't know about concepts like evolution and entropy and information. Although it is interesting how prescient they were about some of the issues that we're currently talking about. I mean, Hobbes, for example, had the idea of mind as a mechanical system. Descartes worried about how we could know whether we're being manipulated by an evil demon with perfect information. So some of the ideas were even envisioned back then, but nonetheless, a commitment to Enlightenment ideals certainly does not mean basing it on dogma from the 18th century. We have to continually develop it, and there are new ethical ideas that I think would have been difficult to discuss in the 18th century. Say, effective altruism. Doing what the data say is the most effective way of improving human welfare. Now, maybe Bentham and Mill would have had the general idea, but the idea of actually gathering huge amounts of data and seeing where your altruism will go farthest, that's really a 21st century idea.
Taking this even further, I mean, in the 18th century, and since then until the 20th century, we kind of had the luxury of ignorance in a way, that nobody really understood us. So questions about free will and manipulation and political power, they all started from the assumption that nobody can really know me, not the government and not some outside system, so that there is a limit also to how much they can manipulate me. So this kind of protected the whole idea of individual autonomy and individual free will, even if it wasn't true, even if people didn't have free will in the 19th century or the 20th century, in practical terms, you paid no price for believing that people act out of their free will, because nobody could really understand and manipulate what was happening inside. But my suspicion is that we are very, very close to the tipping point, and a practical tipping point, when you have an outside system that knows me and knows masses of people better than we know ourselves. And this is a completely new situation in history, which could lead to most of our previous ethical and philosophical ideals, especially with regard to politics, becoming obsolete. And that we don't really have anything to replace them with.
Well, some of the ideas really were anticipated several hundred years ago, because Descartes imagined a demon that could manipulate our perception and have us hallucinate a world that doesn't exist. How do we know we're not victims of an evil demon?
And what was his?
Well, his solution was that God would not deceive us. So that's not going to fly now. But others you argued for scientific rationality, for testability, for fallible but incremental improvements in understanding. I mean, if we were victims of an evil demon, would there be ways of figuring that out if it was a real?
But that's the extreme position. Like today we would say, how do I know that I'm not in a computer simulation?
Yes, right.
And of course the answer is you can't know, and it doesn't matter for anything really. But the practical, I mean, this is a kind of a philosophical riddle. The practical question, which becomes more practical every day, is how do I know that my desires and views are not being controlled by some governmental corporation?
Yeah, but of course, I mean, the denial of free will was also a topic of the 18th century. David Hume posed the question of whether there can really be some uncaused cause of behavior. But going just to shift the conversation a bit, I guess one way in which maybe we do differ, although we agree on so many things, is I guess I'm a bit more skeptical of how rapidly there'll be advances in artificial intelligence, genetic engineering of humans, and psychological manipulation. So I suspect, and I'm perhaps because I'm a little closer to it being a cognitive psychologist and someone interested in behavioral genetics, but I suspect, maybe I'm pessimistic about the development of the technology and therefore perhaps optimistic about the human condition, that I don't think there's going to be a huge progress in genetically improving the human species, simply because of the way that we now understand genes to work. That the old idea that we would find the gene that would give you 10 IQ points, or the gene that would make you live 10 years longer, or the gene for musical talent. You know, we now know that those genes don't exist. That even though those traits are highly heritable, what's sometimes called the fourth law of behavioral genetics, which is that all human heritable traits are the results of thousands of genes, each with a teeny weeny little effect, means that a parent will not be able to put a single gene into their offspring to increase their athletic ability. There'll be thousands of them, which multiplies the chance for error. And since no gene does one thing, almost all genes are pleiotropic. They have multiple effects. You just never know whether some advantage will also come with some risk factor. If you make the brain more efficient, perhaps you're also increasing the chance of brain cancer because the cells are more likely to proliferate. Together with the fact that humans have a lot of squeamishness and taboos that often will retard technological process. Just think of genetically modified organisms for food, where all the arguments say that we'd be much better off if we had genetically modified crops, and we would engineer in the traits that would make them resistant to disease, to pests, we need less pesticide. But people have a irrational but nonetheless highly effective revulsion. So you buy a nut bar and it says no genetically modified organisms. If people aren't willing to give their kids genetically modified applesauce, I'm not sure they're going to be willing to have genetically modified children. So for all those reasons, I suspect that threat might be very far in the future, if ever.
But that's kind of, it's true that genetics has receded in terms of like the impact on the future in the last 10 years, exactly because of these discoveries. But what moves forward is the whole idea of AI and massive systems of surveillance and things like the social credit system that is now being tested in China. And I don't think that we'll see genetically modified superhumans anytime soon, but I do think that there is a chance we'll see some version of digital dictatorships and totalitarian regimes based on this massive surveillance and analysis of humans. And again, I don't think that AI is developing fast enough in order to kind of hack humans perfectly. But the key point is that you don't need perfection. You just need to reach a point when you're better than the average person. And I agree that, to put it in a different way, that AI is far less developed than people tend to think, but humans are also far less developed than people tend to think. So the aim of not the aim, but kind of the test of the AI is not whether it's perfect, it's just whether it's better than humans. And that's a far, far lower bar.
Yes.
So again, what happens on the level of a society, of a political system, when you have something like the Chinese social credit system in 10 years or 20 years, when everybody is monitored all the time, and what you're doing right now goes into the system and enables the system to get to know you better and better. And again, the crucial line in the sand is the moment when the system knows you better than you know yourself, and therefore knows how to predict you and how to press your emotional buttons and so forth. Now, it's not all bad. It can have wonderful implications, say in healthcare. It can improve a lot of the decisions we take in life, but there is a huge dark side. It's not only what would the 21st century Stalin do with it. It's also something like, I don't know, I think about hiring people for a job. And today it's still done in many cases that you send your CV and somebody reads it and they invite you for an interview of 10 minutes. But in 10 years or 20 years, we could reach a point when the whole of life is one long, stressing job interview. Because every moment you're being surveyed, you're in kindergarten, you're meeting friends on the beach, data is being collected. And when 5 years later or 10 years later you apply for a certain job or position in university or anything, the data on what you did in kindergarten or what you did that day on the beach with your friends, it goes into the calculation of the algorithm. And thinking about the whole of life as one long job interview is not...
It's possible, although let's think back to another dystopian projection. 1984, written in 1948, and now 1984 is itself 35 years in the past. But the technology then, Orwell couldn't have conceived of artificial intelligence, but he did imagine the telescreen. There'd be a TV camera in every room. Now, that technology is trivial. I mean, there could be in every room a government-operated camera. They could have done that decades ago, but they haven't, at least certainly not in the West. And so the question is, why didn't they? Partly because the government didn't have that much of an interest in doing it, partly because there would be enough resistance that in a democracy they couldn't succeed. So that kind of pushback, we don't know what that would...
But there was another crucial thing, that you did not have anything to do with the data. I mean, if in 1984, say the Soviet Union decided to put a camera in every house, let's say they could do it.
There's not enough KGB agents to watch
there are not enough KGB agents to look at all the footage. And even if you have a KGB agent looking at all the footage, then the KGB agent just writes this long paper document, and you need another KGB agent to collect all these papers and go over there. And then who is watching all the KGB agents? That's another problem. Now, so it was just, there was nothing to do with the data. Now the big revolution of AI is that suddenly you don't need all these KGB agents to write all these paper reports. You just have machines going over all the data. And again, this is not science fiction, this is happening in various parts of the world. It's happening now in China, it's happening now in my home country in Israel. One of the reasons that the Israeli occupation is so successful is that, and with very few casualties on either side, is that you just have these very sophisticated algorithms going over enormous amounts of data, over millions of people, and that's a complete game changer.
Yeah. So there you've identified two situations where there are pretty close to totalitarian societies, the occupied West Bank and China. I think what you've identified is some of the problems of totalitarian societies or occupying powers. And the key is how to prevent your society from being China, where the challenge may not be the technology, but just to keep a democracy a democracy. And the issue is, are the ordinary expectations of people in it who are not subject to occupation, who are living in a democracy, going to be robust enough and going to be developed to be to rise to the occasion of resisting that kind of constant surveillance, that even though the technology will exist, as the technology for cameras in every room exists, it won't actually be deployed in democracies. So we don't know. But,
I guess in democracies, what we are seeing now is that it's coming from a slightly different direction, what is known as surveillance capitalism. That there is tremendous amount of surveillance, even in a country like the US, but it's not being done by the government, it's being done by private corporations. And so people are far more tolerant of that. But the end result could be very similar. Again, once you have a corporation or a government that knows so much about you, that's a historical game changer, and a lot of all kinds of dystopian science fiction scenarios and all kinds of philosophical thought experiments suddenly become very practical engineering decisions in daily life. And again, going back to the philosophical question, one of my main fears is that we really don't have the kind of philosophical capital to deal with it, because people repeatedly fall back on these kind of, again, classical Enlightenment ideas that no, we need to keep freedom of the press and we need to keep the freedom of individuals and to keep the democratic institutions going. But I think that the technology is a real game changer. All that worked relatively well when the technology was basically on your side. I mean, I think that in the 20th century, one of the main reasons that democracy in free societies and also free markets defeated totalitarian countries was that simply the totalitarian countries were undertaking a technological impossible task. That if you try to collect all the data in a central place and analyze it all there and then take all the decisions there, you can't do it with people writing on paper. So it collapsed. But if you replace the people writing on paper with machine learning algorithms, suddenly totalitarian regimes could have a technological advantage over the democracies. And we grew up, I think, in a kind of very easy situation when doing the efficient thing also meant doing the ethical thing. We didn't have to choose between ethics and efficiency. And you see it in different, like they talk about diversity, that it's both efficient and ethical to have greater diversity in your company. So similarly, it's both efficient and ethical to distribute power and information between many individuals and organizations. But what will happen if and when efficiency and ethic go in different directions? That totalitarianism becomes very effective, but it's still extremely unethical. Would our ethical kind of constraints and ideals hold in that situation?
Well, I think the trade-off between efficiency and ethics is just in the very nature of reality, and it's always faced us, even with much simpler algorithms of the kind you could do with paper and pencil. I mean, for example, in the criminal justice system, you could change the probability of convicting someone based on statistics from their race and their age and their prior criminal record. But there are rules in a courtroom as to what information you can and cannot introduce. Now, of course, when something is mentioned, it can't be unmentioned. But it is a problem we've always faced because it's just in the nature of ethics that trade-off exists. So it could become more acute, but it's not as if that has never been considered before, and we have made decisions that sacrifice efficiency for ethics, they may be more pressing in the future. Again, when it comes to predicting human behavior based on algorithms, which again is not a new idea because Hume and Leibniz and Hobbes thought of the human brain as a mechanical device, which therefore could be subject to physical interventions. I think the ideas have been with us because they are ideas, but and how we deal with them might become more pressing. I suspect that we're going to have more time than we think, simply because even if the human brain is a physical system, which I believe it is, it's extraordinarily complex. And we are, I think, nowhere close to being able to micromanage it, even with artificial intelligence algorithms. The AI algorithms now are very good at playing video games and captioning pictures, but they're often quite stupid when it comes to the low probability combinations of events that they haven't been trained on. And even when it comes to something that you would think would be pretty simple, like a self-driving car, only 3 degrees of freedom. Turn the wheel, gas, brake. We still don't have them. I mean, they were supposed to have been on the roads 10 years ago, but we don't have them. And even the simple problems turn out to be harder than we think. When it comes to hacking human behavior, it's all the more complex. Again, not because there's anything mystical or magic about the human brain. It's just it's an organ. But it is an organ that's subject to fantastic nonlinearities and chaos and unpredictability. And the algorithm that will control our behavior, I don't think is going to be arriving anytime soon. Even for things like manipulating election results with fake news, which was a kind of panic starting in 2016. The studies of the effects of fake news on social media show that the effects are very, very small and probably did not influence the election. That most of the fake news went to people who were already highly partisan and whose minds weren't going to change, and that it's not as easy to manipulate human behavior as we might fear in our dystopian nightmares.
Yeah, I certainly don't think that you can completely micromanage a person. But again, the competition is not against some kind of an infallibility machine. The competition is just against the decisions that humans take.
Yeah.
And yes, the AI is doing a lot of stupid things, but the humans are also doing a lot of stupid things. So you just need to compete with that. And again, a good example is hiring people for a job. That at present, I'm interviewing 10 people. I'm meeting each one of them for like 10, 15 minutes. I need to form some impression about them. I read their like 2 pages CV. And based on that, I basically try to recognize patterns.
Yeah.
And AI can do a much, much better job, even today, or at least in the very near future, by simply going over a lot more data and being far better at recognizing the relevant patterns. So again, I'm not thinking about this science fiction scenario that an AI that micromanages every movement of your day. It starts with far simpler things of just shifting more and more authority to the AI to decide who to accept to university, who to hire for the job, and whom to date.
Yeah.
I don't think we are far from that. Again, not because the AI is so good, but because the humans are so bad.
Yes.
That they make a lot of stupid decisions in these respects. And once the authority starts shifting, then it completely changes the entire life. Again, the image that I have is that the whole life is one long job interview, because anything you do can and will be held against you when they come to decide whether to hire you.
But here's the, I guess here's the reason that that doesn't keep me up at night. One of the most robust findings in psychology is that actuarial decision-making or statistical decision-making is more reliable than human intuition, clinical decision-making. This is a finding that goes back to 1952, that even, forget AI, a simple regression formula, you take 5 predictors, you weight them, add them up, make a decision, much better than a typical human judge. Diagnosing disease, whether someone will be recidivistic for committing a crime again, how well they'll do on the job. So we've known this for 70 years almost. But we typically don't do what actually would be much more rational. Scrap the job interview, look at 5 predictors, add them up, and make the decision that way. We don't do it, even though we could have done that 20 years ago, 40 years ago. So there is the ability to decide rationally or irrationally to disregard the best algorithm. And so far we've done that, maybe not wisely. Maybe we should have relied on algorithms, because we know that job interviews and other kinds of subjective impressions are subject to bias and error, including racist bias. But we don't hand it over to algorithms, even though we could have done it many years ago, which suggests that it's not inevitable that even as the algorithms get much better, that we will hand over the decision making to them. Maybe we should do it more.
My view as a historian is that 70 years isn't a long time.
As your historian, yes, right.
It takes time for the idea to really catch up.
Yeah.
And again, you really just need maybe one country to lead the pack. And if it turns out it's very effective, then it will start spreading and more people emulating it. Now again, you did have a couple of countries trying to do it 60, 70 years ago in the communist bloc.
Yeah.
And it just didn't work. And so this gave us this robust feeling that, well, they'll never be able to do it to humans because it just doesn't work. Look at what happened to the Soviet Union. But if a new cycle begins with a different technology, then I don't think we can be complacent.
No, definitely can't be complacent. Of course, and pushing against that would be if there is any free movement of people, will people leave the society, the surveillance society, and move to the one with greater freedom? All the Chinese graduate students that study in Europe or the United States and kind of enjoy life there.
That's one of the best tests is people voting with their feet.
With their feet, yeah.
We have a couple of minutes left, and I would like us to shift the topic a bit and speak about the intellectual climate of the West today, because the topics we discussed, they are related to the intellectual life generally at the universities and within the scientific community. So maybe you would kind of point out some problems with this intellectual climate of the West, and maybe you would also suggest some solutions how we can improve the intellectual life and the flow of ideas in the modern world today.
Well, there certainly is cause for concern about intellectual openness in the institutions that are supposed to promote it, namely universities. There has been an ideological narrowing. That is, universities are getting becoming more monocultures of left-wing thought. I mean, that's been documented. There are more Marxist professors in most schools than there are conservatives. And there are notorious incidents of suppression of open debate on university campuses. Well, I've been pushing back, and others have. In terms of projecting to the future, looking at what younger people are, what values they carry. On the one hand, there's some optimism in those of us who are worried about authoritarian populism, in that it is kind of an old person's ideology, and the support for populism falls off with generational cohort. There are far fewer 20-somethings who are supporters of Trump. The question is whether the ideology of that generation is going to be so focused on social justice warfare and intersectionality that the ideals of open society, reason, debate will be subsumed under race, class, and sexual orientation warfare. And we don't know the answer. I don't know whether to be optimistic or not.
I think one thing I would say is that we shouldn't generalize from the cultural wars in the US to the world as a whole. And I'm not an expert on what's going on in US universities, but far worse things are happening in places like Hungary, like Russia,
yes,
where the suppression is definitely the other way around, that entire departments are being closed So this is one thing we need to bear in mind. The other, even more general comment is that scientists and scholars don't like it, but they will have the obligation to be more and more drawn into the political realm, because more and more of the major problems of the world will be tied with scientific and technological progress and scientific understanding. The main change factors in the world today, whether it's nuclear technology, whether it's climate change, whether it's artificial intelligence and bioengineering, in order to deal with them, you need a scientific understanding. And the latest discoveries and inventions of the scientists can very quickly change the political and economic landscape. Now, of course, this is not completely new. Technology and science always changed the world, but I think that the scale and the speed it is happening right now is more than ever before. So the distance from the laboratory to the market and to the parliament is becoming shorter and shorter. And most scientists don't like it because they don't want to get involved in politics. Yeah. But I think they will have a greater and greater responsibility, first of all, to educate the public and to educate the political system. We see it now happening with climate change. Again, in many ways, it's worrying that science is being politicized, but I don't see any way around it. That it happened to climate science, it will happen to more and more disciplines. So again, going back to the suppression of certain departments, at present, like in Hungary or Russia, so gender studies is being blamed for being, it's not science, it's politics, it's ideology. But this will happen to more and more departments. So we couldn't let we shouldn't abandon the gender studies department in its fight, because it will come to more and more departments. Now climate science is also politicized, and soon computer science will be politicized. I think that in a way, coders and computer scientists are changing the world more than almost anybody else, but they don't have the necessary background in ethics and politics. And so first of all, scientists need to educate. You don't need a PhD in computer science, but you do need a better understanding of what's happening and what's coming, because it's very relevant to political decisions. And secondly, they have to take greater responsibility for what they are doing. And for example, if you're an engineer, and you're developing some new tool in any field. So I would say take a few minutes or a few hours, think about the politician you most fear in the world, and now think, what will he or she do with my invention? The general tendency of engineers and entrepreneurs is to think about the best case scenarios. So every now and then, take some time off, think what the politician you most fear will do with my invention, and then think again about what you're inventing and creating.
Thank you, gentlemen. I think we're perfect in terms of timing. It was a really rich and interesting discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.